The year is 2016, and a mysterious group of hackers emerged from the shadows to carry out one of the most daring cyber heists in history. They claim to have stolen top-secret military-grade hacking tools straight from the US government, and were auctioning them off to the highest bidder. What followed was a series of leaks so devastating that they would shake the global economy to its core, even going as far as causing tens of billions of dollars in damages. From an auction gone wrong, to raids from the FBI, to the speculation of who these mysterious hackers are, to even the deployment of cyber weapons across the globe, this is the story of the Shadow Brokers, the secretive group behind the most deadly and notorious hack the world has ever seen. Our story begins in August of 2016, when an unknown hacker group decided to pull off the impossible and infiltrate the United States' most secret cyber facility, the National Security Agency, also known as the NSA. Although much of what the NSA works on is classified information, the hacker group learned that if they could access their systems, they would obtain a trove of military-grade cyber weapons and tools that they could use for whatever they desired. And so, it began. While staying completely undetected, they were able to intercept data files from a secret organization called the Equation Group, which supposedly was tied extremely closely to the NSA. After scanning through the stolen files, the hackers quickly realized they hit a gold mine. They now had countless military-grade cyber weapons that they could do whatever they wanted with. Although not much is known about how these hackers stole the data, it was clear that they pulled off the perfect heist without anyone finding out, at least for now. Shortly after, a new account named Shadow Brokers was created on Twitter, and their first tweet simply read,
Equation Group, Cyberweapons Auction.
Interestingly, the name Shadow Brokers was most likely inspired by the Mass Effect video game series, where the Shadow Broker was a mysterious figure trading in information, always selling to the highest bidder. And that's exactly what they planned to do. Alongside the first tweet, they posted a link to Imager, containing screenshots of various folders and files, which were most likely some of the supposed cyber weapons they were going to auction off. Only a few minutes later, the account would also post links to a paste bin, which contained more information about their auction. In their message, they claimed to have infiltrated the Equation Group, an elite hacking team linked directly to the NSA, and creators of infamous cyber weapons that have literally changed the world, like Stuxnet, Dooku, and Flame. To prove that they have hacked the Equation Group, the Shadow Brokers released some files for free. However, they kept the best files for auction, offering state-sponsored cyber tools to the highest bidder. They requested that any interested individual or organization should send their bid in Bitcoin to a specific address, along with their contact information. At the end of the auction, whoever sent the most Bitcoin would receive the coveted best files, but the losers would forfeit their Bitcoin altogether. However, if $1 million is bid in Bitcoin, then they plan to release the files for everyone to enjoy. They end off their post with a Q&A, along with a message to the wealthy elites of the world, calling them criminals, but at the same time trying to get them to bid in their auction. Users on Twitter slowly began to take notice of these tweets, many of them commenting on the Shadow Brokers' terrible English, although most users were absolutely fascinated. If the Shadow Brokers were telling the truth, and they actually had NSA military-grade hacking tools, then it would be game-changing. In the wrong hands, these programs could be capable of everything from shutting down power grids, to taking control of nuclear weapons, to manipulating the New York Stock Exchange, to even hacking into some of the most secure government systems. At the end of the day, if it's in the digital world, then anything is possible. However, some users were convinced and believed that these so-called shadow brokers were running an elaborate scam.
Access to #NSA would be too valuable to spoil in a leak. Don't believe in an actual hack. #Shadow Brokers.
Because of the speculation, some users decided to dive into the free files the Shadow Brokers unleashed to the public to see if they actually released anything promising, so they got to work. After looking into these files, they found some interesting stuff. The programs allowed them to do everything from opening untraceable backdoors into Linux, Windows, and macOS devices, to completely hiding any trace of a hack by covertly changing the device's audit and event logs. Notably, it had a host of exploits targeting Solaris OS devices, which IT companies commonly used at the time. Even though some of the exploits were outdated and already patched, it became increasingly clear that the Shadow Brokers were the real deal, and this hack could potentially put cyber weapons of mass destruction into the hands of terrorist organizations or bad actors. To make things even worse, it was only a matter of time before that happened, which would eventually thrust the world into uncontrollable chaos. But more on that later. Before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, Aura. Hackers around the globe like the Shadow Brokers use the internet to their advantage and can dig up information on just about anyone. Because of this, I decided to search up my personal email address online, and I found that random websites I'd used were caught in large data breaches. This is crazy because I'm always super careful about what I click and download on the internet. But of course, it wasn't my fault. This was due to hackers being able to find exploits in these companies, and then releasing my information on the dark web. That's why I started using Aura. Think of it as a digital bodyguard, tirelessly scanning the dark web and notifying me if my personal information is being traded or sold. They even take it a step further by automatically removing my data from broker websites, minimizing the risk of it ending up in the wrong hands to begin with. If you're ready to take control of your personal information and safeguard your online presence, check out Aura at aura.com/Pezle or click the link in the description to start your 2-week free trial today. Thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring this video. Even though the shadow brokers only released a free sample of their tamest hacking tools, the many corporations caught in the leak were exposed to anonymous hackers around the world. Cisco was actually one of the only companies to publicly address the exploits, and they even explained it in detail. Luckily, this fix was easy, and the only thing their customers had to do was update their software. However, other companies that were exploited frantically attempted to patch these leaks that shadow brokers exposed, and surprisingly, most of them didn't even publicly acknowledge these vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, some users online decided to begin bidding on the unreleased stronger cyber tools in hopes they would win, to potentially have the world at their fingertips. A user with the name of Mike Dam would begin the bidding at just 0.0424 Bitcoin, or about $24 at the time.
I'm now the high bidder for the hashtag shadow brokers cash.
And so it began. People would begin bidding on these tools, and quickly it would reach a total balance of about $900. But users would remain skeptical.
Do you have $850 to throw away just for fun? I sure don't.
Others were astonished that the files were going for so low.
$850 is a bargain if the remaining files are as good as the leaked data so far. Anyone calling NSA exploits release lame has literally zero clue value of such code. Remote unorthodox Cisco picks and ASA code is internet god mode.
Although, when it came down to it, not a lot of people wanted to participate in the auction. So even though these tools could be worth millions upon millions of dollars, the bids continued to stay low and ended at around 2 Bitcoin, which at the time was just around $1,100. Unfortunately for them, the shadow brokers didn't raise nearly enough money, so they decided to keep the files secret, at least for the time being. Meanwhile, experts in the cybersecurity field like Edward Snowden began to comment on the situation. Interestingly, Snowden was once an insider at the NSA, and he earned his fame after he leaked over 200,000 of their internal files, just a few years prior. Because of this, he fled from the United States and was taken in with open arms by the Russian government. But anyway, Snowden believed that state actors, namely Russia, were likely responsible for this attack for a number of different reasons. However, he also noted it's highly unusual for governments to share tools like these openly. Most government-aligned groups would keep them private, reverse engineer them, and create their own versions. In Snowden's view, there was only one viable explanation. The leak was a message.
This leak is likely a warning that someone can prove US responsibility for any attacks that originated from this malware server. This could have significant foreign policy consequences, particularly if any of those operations targeted US allies.
So Snowden was pretty much saying that whoever was leaking these messages could have copious amounts of information on hacks performed by the US government. On top of this, depending on who the US was collecting data on, it could affect the world order, especially if they were infiltrating an ally nation. Because of all this, the hack would absolutely blow up online, and everyone was wondering who the shadow brokers really were and what insane tools that they stole from the government that was hiding behind their Bitcoin paywall. A small number of news agencies would also begin to take notice.
A group calling themselves the Shadow Brokers claim that they've hacked the NSA, according to foreignpolicy.com. They say they stole malware and they're auctioning off the files. Security researchers say the claims appear to be legitimate. A former NSA scientist says it could be hugely damaging, blowing some operations up. They are auctioning off what they call the best files for at least $550 million. The agency didn't respond to questions about the alleged breach.
Funnily enough, most news agencies like this one thought that shadow brokers were asking for 1 million Bitcoin, which would have been translated to $550 million, or 5% of the total supply of Bitcoin in the world. Of course, this is absolutely ridiculous, and they were just asking for $1 million US. But while the media was struggling to understand what was even going on, the US federal government was working silently behind the scenes to find out who the shadow brokers really were. So the FBI teamed up with the NSA, and they launched a full-scale investigation. What ensued was a game of cat and mouse. The shadow brokers toyed with the authorities, taunting them with irregular updates on Twitter and releasing more hacking tools. Each post seemed designed to show off their untouchable status, openly mocking the FBI's inability to track them down. They even released another pastebin post, written as if from the perspective of Kim Jong-un, where they repeated the auction offer, trolling any investigators analyzing it. About a month later, they released another message to the world, but this time on Reddit. In it, they mocked the lack of mainstream media coverage, dismissing skeptics as talking heads, and doubled down on their claim that the auction of Equation Group hacking tools was real. They encouraged anyone interested to learn more. In their FAQ section, they spoke about how, despite having targeted one of the world's most sophisticated hacking groups, they showed no fear of getting caught, even expecting the Equation Group to bid in their auction themselves. But of course, they were met with skepticism on Reddit.
The problem is that there is no escrow, and no incentive to hand over any code once this auction is done. All the incentive in the world is behind taking the money and keeping the exploits for themselves. That is exactly what I would do in their shoes. Why wouldn't they do it themselves?
Users on Reddit also demanded proof that the shadow brokers had more stuff to offer.
Release a significant exploit. Extra Beacon and Epic Banana were valuable, but the problem lies in continued skepticism. If you really carry exploits that are as significant as you claim they are, according to your initial posting, better than Stuxnet, which mind you is a fairly large claim to make, the only way you are going to fetch a significant bid is if you prove it.
But the post would soon die down, and the shadow brokers would not respond to any of the messages. However, everything would change when Kaspersky Lab, a Moscow-based cybersecurity company, connected a few dots. Apparently, a Twitter user named Hal9 sent 2 messages to researchers in the company before the leak. In the first one, he said he needed to talk to the CEO, and in the second, he warned his request would expire in 3 weeks. Strangely, after the researchers responded, he quickly blocked their accounts. But here's where it gets interesting. Just 30 minutes later, the shadow brokers made their first leak on August 13th. Because of this, the Kaspersky researchers looked into Hal9, and after a quick Google search, they found the same username on a personal ad seeking female sex partners interested in, well, let's just say, some pretty kinky stuff. Anyway, after checking the profile picture, they were able to trace it to a 51-year-old man named Harold Thomas Martin, a contractor from the NSA. Because of this, Kaspersky Lab decided to report him to US intelligence. This was enough for the FBI to issue a search warrant. Soon after, dozens of armed FBI agents and even a SWAT team stormed in to raid his house. During the search, they found 50 terabytes worth of stolen data, which he had been collecting for 20 years, spanning all the way back to 1996. A lot of the data was believed to be connected to the shadow brokers, so the Department of Justice charged Harold with stealing classified material, including source codes for NSA hacking tools. But even after a prolonged investigation, no other link could have been found between Thomas and the shadow brokers. So investigators considered they may have stolen the data from Harold, despite there being no evidence of his devices being hacked. Regardless, he was arrested a few days later, on August 29th. The case looked like a slam dunk, a lead that would finally bring the shadow brokers to justice. But despite how obvious the connection seemed, no proof was ever found linking Harold to the hackers, and the shadow brokers slipped away once again, leaving investigators empty-handed. On October 15th, the shadow brokers claimed to have leaked a conversation between former President Bill Clinton and former Attorney General Loretta Lynch. This was important at the time because Loretta was in charge of the FBI, which is the organization that was looking into an email scandal with Hillary Clinton. But of course, the shadow brokers were just trolling in an attempt to get attention, and the supposed leaked conversation was just a made-up porno between Bill and Loretta.
Toasted salad Billy, oh fuck yeah.
Loretta, you're not going to tell anyone, are you? This will just be our little secret.
Okay, that's enough of that. You get the picture. Anyway, the real reason behind this post was to make a new announcement. They were ending the auction for the files behind the paywall, stating that there were no winners. Instead, they proposed a new approach. They would publicly release the password to the better files once they received 10,000 Bitcoin, or about $5.5 million US. They framed it as a crowdfunding effort and emphasized the shared risk and reward, suggesting this way everyone could win. But this was all happening right before a big election, and the idea of Russian hackers was a massive issue that was well covered. The then Vice President Joe Biden was interviewed by NBC and made several comments, including this one.
I talked with former Russian ambassador Mike McFaul.
Yeah.
And we talked about the idea that every once you got to respond when they're hacking. You got to do something. He described it as a high hard one. Maybe just sort of like in baseball, you throw a high hard one to send a message. Why haven't we sent a message yet to Putin?
We're sending a message.
What he said here was implying that the United States was preparing a cyber counterattack against Russia, and people like Edward Snowden just had to comment on this.
I get the feeling nobody told VP Joe Biden what covert operation means.
Despite not being singled out by Joe Biden, the shadow brokers were not fans of what he said, so they released another message accusing Joe of using the CIA to fight a cyber war against Russia, and they even said they might attempt to disrupt the 2016 election. But later that month, the shadow brokers decided to drop their biggest leak yet, sharing a list of servers used by the NSA to hack foreign governments. With this list, the public would now know which countries the NSA has targeted, along with the servers that most likely still had vulnerabilities. According to the leak, the NSA targeted over 49 countries, with China, Russia, Korea, and Japan being the most targeted. Because of this, those countries were able to patch up their flawed systems, and now knew that the United States had been taking data from them. But that's not it. Experts used this leak to theorize what programs the shadow brokers were auctioning off, and one predicted it was most likely an exploit for the Solaris operating system used by the NSA hacking servers. In other words, they believed that the shadow brokers' tools could allow an attacker to gain shell access to a computer or server, meaning they could do whatever they wanted with the device. Given the group had already leaked a suite for hacking Solaris OS devices, this seemed like a fair guess. But after, the shadow brokers did what no one expected. They would go silent for over a month, and there would be no activity on their Twitter or any other pages at all. The August and October leaks faded from memory, and along with them, the pool of potential buyers for their products dwindled. Even the 2016 presidential election would pass without so much as a comment. Then, in December, the tide shifted once more when a suspicious account called Bucephus Cletus popped up on Twitter. Looking closely, this account is strange. It contains a mix of both American and Nazi symbols, and clearly it is a fake user that is attempting to troll or upset others. But here's where the account gets interesting. One of the tweets is an article written by Bucephus, which was published on Medium, called "Are the Shadow Brokers Selling NSA Tools on ZeroNet?" This is what he said.
Well, howdy partners, I don't want to be getting arrested for passing on fake news and all. I reckon I ain't no security professional, but I am what you might call a ZeroNet enthusiast. I figured y'all might enjoy something I found on the old ZeroNets. Those dastardly old shadow brokers have themselves a site on the ZeroNet. Yep, and as far as I can tell, they appears to be selling NSA tools individually now.
Within the post, there's a link to a mysterious website that appears to be created by the shadow brokers. The site contains a list of all the specific exploits with the prices, a contact page, and lastly, their latest message. Since both of their auctions completely failed, the shadow brokers decided to let buyers choose which tools they wanted to purchase, hoping that they would finally begin to make some money. Interested buyers would then email the shadow brokers with the name of the tool they wanted, receive a Bitcoin address for the payment, and upon payment, get a link and decryption password for the files. They emphasized that all files came signed, ensuring their authenticity. The news broke quickly, with mainstream publications like Vice jumping in to get the scoop. Immediately, the Bucephus account started to draw suspicion, as it was evident it wasn't a real person. His presence and mannerisms were so odd that the only plausible explanation is that the account was just a front for the shadow brokers. But after this, both the Twitter and Medium accounts went silent and remain inactive even to this day. Although the shadow brokers' Twitter account began promoting their new store, they even shared screenshots of files containing their most sophisticated tech, including programs like Second Date, which could redirect users to specific websites of the attacker's choosing. Anyway, the shadow brokers would post on and off for weeks, but even after all of their hype on Twitter, it appeared that not too many people were interested in buying their tools.
The shadow brokers is closed. No more sales. No more messages. See message finale.
However, the shadow brokers left another message, letting people know that their offer was still standing, and if they reached 10,000 Bitcoin, they would release all the files to the public. But this time, they were brewing something extraordinary behind the scenes, which would shake the world in a way that would affect more people than they could ever dream of. And just like that, the shadow brokers went dark for the unseeable future. After nearly 4 months of complete inactivity, the shadow brokers came alive once again in April 2017, and this time, they were back with vengeance, releasing a Medium post called "Don't Forget Your Base." In this post, it's clear that the shadow brokers were absolutely furious. They talk about how they've supported the then President Trump, but he hasn't done what they wanted him to do, alleging he had abandoned his various campaign promises. The shadow brokers also explained that they weren't aligned with the Russian government, and even have America's best interest in mind. But those who decided to read the entirety of the document would be rewarded, because the single most important part was right at the end.
The shadow brokers has is having little of each as our auction was an apparent failure. Be considering this our form of protest.
The shadow brokers then did it. They released the coveted NSA files that they have been tirelessly attempting to sell, and this time, there was no $1 million paywall. It would be free for everyone. With Easter right around the corner, the shadow brokers timed this perfectly to create as much destruction as possible. While most cyber defense experts who worked for big corporations would be home for the long weekend, the anonymous hackers worldwide that would use these tools were not. For them, this would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use some of the most sophisticated cyber weapons ever made. So hackers from around the globe quickly dove into the tools to see what they contained. And what they found was better than anyone could ever dream of. It was clear that the cyber weapons were worth far more than $1 million and could easily do damage in the billions. The hackers initially found that most of these programs were capable of hacking into Middle Eastern banks. So by using this exploit, they could steal money, search through private transactions, access credentials, and literally do everything that a bank employee would be able to do. But crazily enough, that wouldn't even be the most valuable tool among all that was leaked. It was clear that one of them in particular would stand out as extremely dangerous, and it was called Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue is a cyber exploit that takes advantage of a vulnerability in something called the Server Message Block Protocol. This is used in office environments for sharing files and connecting to devices like printers over a network. But Eternal Blue takes advantage of that and allows attackers to execute malicious code without detection, giving them unauthorized full access to a system. The exploit could use scripts to spread to other devices on the network, remaining hidden as it moves. Once the hacker has control of the computer, they can do whatever they please, from installing malware, to stealing data, to even locking up the computer until a fee is paid. As catastrophic as the leak was, there's an interesting piece to the story. Shortly before the leak, Microsoft released a mysterious patch that made several of these hacking tools absolutely useless. What made this unusual is that Microsoft gave no credit for the discovery of these vulnerabilities, which is highly uncommon in the tech world. So how did they know to fix these issues? It's speculated that a researcher at the NSA had personally reached out to Microsoft, revealing the existence of Eternal Blue and a slew of other exploits before it ever became public. The researchers probably felt like they had to do this because they understood the power of Eternal Blue better than anyone else. And if it was left unchecked, it would create vast amounts of chaos in the world. Unsurprisingly, Eternal Blue was so dangerous that some other NSA officials reported that they had wanted to warn Microsoft as soon as the vulnerability was discovered. However, even with the patches, most Microsoft products remained vulnerable to Eternal Blue. While home computers tend to update the same day, office computers in major firms sometimes take months to install simple security updates. With part of the NSA's cyberweapon arsenal in the hands of hackers, there was no telling what would happen. Although, the answer came in the next 2 weeks, when over 200,000 computers were accessed using another leaked tool called Double Pulsar, which enabled hackers to offload malware directly into the target computer. Experts weighed in, realizing this was just the start, but no one could have guessed what happened next. In May 2017, the world would soon be shaken by one of the most devastating cyber attacks in history. Anonymous hackers figured out that they could use a combination of the military-grade cyber tools that were now available to them. By doing this, they could create something so powerful, it would be almost impossible to stop. So they first began by using Eternal Blue to access office computers. After that, they implemented a modified version of Double Pulsar to deliver the payload, which encrypted the victim's files and displayed a ransom note on their computer. On the surface, it worked much like any other ransomware program, infecting a computer and locking it down until a fee was paid, which in this case was $300 in Bitcoin. People initially believed it had spread through a phishing campaign, but the reality was much more dire. The hack would absolutely blow up all over the world, targeting over 300,000 computers across 150 countries. It would now be known as the WannaCry virus. The damage was so widespread that it literally affected every single continent. However, nowhere was hit nearly as badly as in the UK. Many of their government websites, including the National Health Service, were unable to operate, preventing countless sick individuals from getting access to the healthcare services they needed. The country was in absolute crisis mode.
Hospitals have been badly hit, including this one in central London. Since Friday, it's been struggling to get back online.
I did have breast cancer 2 years ago. I have an annual mammogram just to make sure that everything is okay, that nothing's happening, because it can at any time recur. So it's a little bit frustrating to come and I can't be reassured.
The hospital told Ken Robbins his cancer surgery was delayed.
They phoned me up this morning and said it's too important to have my operation. Come in straight away and they're going to do it.
What is your message to the hackers who created this ransom?
To put it bluntly, he's and he needs to go to prison for 20 years. They don't realise what impact they're having on patients.
The WannaCry hackers even targeted companies like Disney.
Well, hackers claim to be holding a Disney movie for ransom. They reportedly got a hold of the new Pirates of the Caribbean movie and are demanding Bitcoin from Disney in exchange for it. But Disney says it won't be paying up and it's working with the FBI to track down the movie.
The world's top cybersecurity experts worked to find a solution, and after countless hours of research, the virus seemed impossible to beat, at least until a researcher named Marcus Hutchins discovered something odd in WannaCry's code. Before the virus locked down a PC, it would check whether a certain gibberish URL would lead to a web page. So the researcher purchased the domain name to see what would happen. This single thing rendered the virus completely harmless, and while it continued to infect computers, it was unable to encrypt any of the files. In the end, the attack caused $4 billion in damages and brought many businesses to a standstill. The entire world was shaken, with the US government publicly blaming the attack on North Korea, and it seemed like things would go back to normal. But of course, this was only the beginning, and on June 17th, Ukraine's cyber infrastructure began to fall apart. ATMs stopped working, and 80 miles north of Kyiv, computers monitoring radiation levels at Chernobyl also stopped functioning. Across Russia and the United States, banks and hospitals completely ceased to function, and the cause was a new virus called Pezle.
The virus looks like this, a screen of red text. It instructs its victims to pay $300 in Bitcoin to regain access to the infected computer's files. At this Ukrainian television station, the ransomware spread like wildfire.
The computer became uncontrollable. A chain reaction started, the first, the second, third, fourth, fifth computer, and it spread across the whole newsroom.
Unlike WannaCry, Pezle wasn't a brand new virus. It first appeared in 2016, and it became widely popular in the darknet, where the creator started selling it as a service. The version used for this hack, often called Not Pezle, used the Eternal Blue exploit to gain access to office spaces, but it was coupled with a complementary exploit called Eternal Romance, which was also leaked by the Shadow Broker's crew. If those didn't work, the virus also used a specialized tool to scour the hard drive for login information, which would be used automatically. It then used Double Pulsar and PsExec, a legitimate Windows tool to track system internals to execute and inject the payload. The Pezle attack was extremely deadly and efficient, so much so that it would make the WannaCry virus look like a joke. Dozens of major businesses across the world reported losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars, with the hardest hit landing on a pharmaceutical company called Merck, which alone lost $870 million. The virus also completely froze the Ukrainian economy for 3 full days, costing the state $400 million in damages, and it permanently destroyed 10% of all the country's computers. Part of what made it so devastating is that unlike WannaCry, the virus deleted all the files on the victim's computer, regardless of whether the ransom was paid. The world was in absolute chaos, and companies were frantically trying to figure out how to prevent this attack. Unfortunately, after some investigations, this virus didn't have a kill switch that was easily accessible by researchers. Instead, cyber expert Amit Serper, while in his parents' living room, was able to reverse engineer Not Pezle. He found that adding a new file in a specific location in a computer would trick the malware into quitting and shutting down. But at this point, the Not Pezle virus became the most devastating cyber attack in history, and according to the White House, it costed an estimated $10 billion in damages. As the dust settled, people started pointing fingers at the most obvious culprit, Russia. So in February 2018, the White House publicly accused the Kremlin of these attacks. While the evidence they had wasn't made public, there were some pointers. According to Ukrainian cybersecurity experts, the goal of the virus was a cleanup effort to wipe away espionage and reconnaissance data, which at the time could have incriminated the Russian government. Regardless of who it was, the threat of the NSA hacking tools only caused more fear, as major infrastructure continued to be deeply vulnerable to these attacks. Luckily, Not Pezle was the last major attack that used them. However, the Eternal Blue vulnerability continued to be exploited well into 2019, with various other localized attacks. It was even used in an attack on the city of Baltimore, freezing thousands of computers and crippling the function of the city government for 3 weeks. But the shadow brokers weren't done yet, and the United States government became aggravated and determined to find the people behind the group. But for now, the shadow brokers relished in the chaos they caused. The damage done by these 2 viruses deeply pleased the shadow brokers, proving the destructive potential of their hacking tools. So they decided to go back to social media, where they announced they would continue leaking even more cyberweapons every month. Notably though, they began to target individuals who called them out for their antics online. This included a man called Jake Williams, or Malware Jake, the then CEO of Rendition InfoSec. He had been reporting on the shadow brokers' activities since the beginning, spreading the word and pushing companies to improve. As it turns out, the shadow brokers weren't fans of him, and in April, following the massive dump, the shadow brokers called him out on Twitter, correctly identifying him as a former NSA hacker. They followed it up by mentioning highly classified technical details about his operations. To make things absolutely terrifying, Jake later told the news that very few people knew these details, and even other members of the NSA hacking group wouldn't have known. Besides scaring the soul out of Jake, this revelation demonstrated that the shadow brokers have significant insider information, which destroyed the theory that they had merely hacked a single NSA server with the tools already on it. Because of this, the NSA was certain there must have been an insider, so they decided to put every single one of their employees through a lie detector test. After thorough investigations, one man was put under the spotlight, although at this point he remained unidentified. Quickly after, the Washington Post alleged that the Russian government had gained access to the NSA hacking tools via the Kaspersky antivirus software. Apparently, this unnamed employee had brought several hacking tools to his home, and then downloaded them to his personal laptop, which was already compromised by hackers. The man was later identified as Nguyen Hong Pho, a 67-year-old Vietnamese American who had been contracted to work for the NSA back in 2005. Still, the shadow brokers showed no fear, so they posted saying they would change the pricing for the subscription service. However, it's possible the whole thing might have been another failure. A user going by FS Your Mom posted a rant on Steemit.
The shadow brokers ripped me off. I paid 500 XMR for their Wine of the Month club and only they sent me a single tool that already requires me to have a box exploited. A tool, not even an exploit. The tool also looks to be old, and not close to what the shadow brokers said could be in their subscription service.
The rest of the post was a scalding critique of the shadow brokers, as the poster complained about everything from their money-grubbing antics to their terrible grammar. Though the story didn't make any waves, it was later confirmed that the user did in fact purchase the tools from the shadow brokers. Although the October update was the last thing that the world would hear from the group, they wiped nearly all traces of their activity, leaving behind only questions. To this day, no one has come close to cracking the case. Were the shadow brokers truly Russian agents, part of a state-sponsored operation? Or were they independent hackers, cleverly planting false clues to frame Russia and throw investigators off their trail? One journalist raised an intriguing point. Much of the metadata in the shadow brokers' files appeared deliberately designed to suggest Russian origins. And if Bocephus truly was the shadow brokers in disguise, as all evidence suggests, then they clearly could write in fluent English. This raises the question, why do they choose broken grammar, riddled with mistakes, as their voice? We may never know who they were, or who they worked for. All we know is that they pulled off one of the most devastating and mysterious cyber attacks in history, and then vanished into the digital ether. Who knows, they might even make a return sometime in the future.